Hey everybody, I hope everybody can hear me, especially those in the overflow room. For those here in the room, again, I'm trying to talk as loud as I can, but I also don't want to deafen anybody in the overflow room by yelling, so we're just going to roll with it. Today we're going to talk about React Native and Expo CLI, and we're going to talk about some of the basics of creating and testing your first app that you could maybe eventually deploy to an application store. For those who are interested who might want to follow along, now granted Wi-Fi here is not great, so is cell service. If you want, there's an app where you'll be able to follow along. If you want to download that, it's on Android and iOS. There's also a link to the repository, though granted that's not going to do you very good right now for when you look at these slides later. So I'm going to leave this up for just a second here, and then we're going to go on to the next page. And again, eventually here, I'm going to show some live code where we're going to be able to see the application running directly on your phone. Okay, so the focus of this presentation, first we're going to talk about what React Native is for those who aren't very familiar with it, who's using it, pros and cons, when to use it, issues that people have heard in the past, Airbnb stopped using it, and why that's not as big of a deal these days. And then we're going to go to Expo, what Expo is, what it does for you, how you can use it, and then we'll talk about creating our first application using the native React components. So the first off, what is React Native? And so I assume most people are familiar with what React is. So React is, of course, a JavaScript library for building web pages that you can access on desktop and mobile PCs. So Meta decided to come out with a framework called React Native, which is built on top of the React library and will transform React components so that they will work across both iOS and Android ecosystems. So as the image here on the right will show, iOS might call something, for example, a UI view, where Android might call it a view group, an image versus or image view versus a UI image view. There's little hiccups between developing in one environment versus the other, and the goal with React Native is to have one code base that you can deploy to both application stores. So who's using it? Of course, Meta is, Facebook, Instagram, things like that. Discord is using it, Walmart's using it, though not pictured. Many of Microsoft's apps are on it, including things like Teams, Teams, Word, and other Office applications. So there's a lot of people who are using it, and again, it's been really growing a lot more in popularity. So you might be thinking, why would I use what are the pros and cons of React Native? I know I can develop an application, for example, in Android and Kotlin, or I can do it for iOS and Swift. So the first obvious pro is that it's one framework for both ecosystems, which is a huge benefit, especially for smaller scale teams who might not have the number of people who they can use to manage two code bases across two different languages. JavaScript is also the #1 most used language in the world. Let me rephrase that. The #1 most used programming language. I'm sure there are many spoken languages used more than JavaScript. So there is an easier hurdle where a lot of developers know how to write in JavaScript. If you're good with React, you're going to be able to pick up React Native. It supports both class and component-based design, so you can use hooks, for example. So any of your React experience should translate over relatively easily to React Native. Another thing is there's a large set of packages built to hook into native functionality. It's going to be challenging to write that stuff from the ground up for yourself, to ask for camera permissions or geolocation or something like that, whereas there's a robust ecosystem already built to do a lot of that work for you. Hot reload, for example, is another big benefit where you can make changes right on your machine and see them right on your phone. We're used to it when developing for the web, but it's kind of newer for a lot of application development. So why wouldn't you use it? Don't use it for building games. If you have some big dream to build the next microtransaction game or something like that, use Unity, use something else. React Native it's not great for that kind of stuff. It's not great for augmented reality or 3D. it's too intensive for JavaScript to have to compile that all on the fly. Because again, the JavaScript layer then gets transpiled into Swift or Kotlin on the fly, and so to do all that will cause major performance impacts. You are reliant on community-made packages. If, for example, a developer decides they're done supporting the package, you either have to hope somebody else picks it up or you got to find a new one, or write it yourself. And maybe at that point you might be asking yourself, well, if I'm writing the package myself, why don't I just develop in the original languages? And then because it's cross-platform design, some UX design might want to really specialize in Apple's design system, making it look like an Apple app versus an Android app. And with React Native, though it's very possible, it does require a lot of extra boilerplate code, where you might again be thinking to yourself, am I really saving time by having one code base with a bunch of if-else statements to handle, am I on iOS or Android? Real quickly, we'll breeze through this slide a little faster than the last one. So when are you going to use React Native? In my opinion, you should use React Native in 3 or 4 examples. And so the first one that I would do is cost. If you've got a tight budget that you need to get an app turned around in, I would strongly look at using React Native. Again, JavaScript is an easy to understand language, maybe to a fault. So you should be able to turn around a working prototype app very quickly that can be iterated on and improved. It's nice to then, again, it's nice to be able to have one code base to handle both applications. And also, I think it's a great idea if you have a team of experienced JavaScript developers. So we're going to talk about React Native. If you have a team of experienced .NET developers, look into Xamarin or Maui. If you've got a team of good Java developers, look into Flutter. There are other options. We're just talking about React Native. So again, if you've got a team that's good at JavaScript, they're going to be good at React Native. When not to, again, I already talked about video games. I think it's a very reasonable thing to say you hate JavaScript. There are jokes all about JavaScript on why people don't like it. TypeScript tries to solve it, but if you're not a big JavaScript proponent, React Native isn't going to change your opinion. Don't look for it to change that opinion, and that's okay. Again, there are other libraries available for you to use to do that. So I'd mentioned before that Airbnb had stopped using React Native a while ago. So and I had heard this as a discussion point when I was talking to coworkers and even salespeople about why we should be looking into using React Native more instead of just for our internal projects that we've been building. And the truth is that if you were asked my opinion, React Native wasn't production ready till about 8 months to a year ago. And so the reasons for that, one is, and we're going to talk about it next, is the Expo CLI and the SDK. And this team of developers came along from Expo, and they have vastly streamlined the development experience, providing better documentation, better error handling, and a better pipeline for being able to deploy something from your computer to the App Store or the Play Store. It's a huge one. Another big one, very recently, Meta came out with a new JavaScript compiler called Hermes. And so the long story short is Hermes is a JavaScript compiler built from the ground up to deploy JavaScript out to your phones. And so it's maybe not as big of a deal when you're dealing with customers primarily in the United States, but when you're dealing with overseas customers where you don't have necessarily the level of confidence in the quality of the phone, you need something that can compile JavaScript a lot faster, and that's what Hermes is built for. And then, as it says at the bottom, Airbnb stopped using React Native in 2018. That was 5 years ago. Like, I know time feels crazy since the pandemic, believe me, but 5 years is a long time in the development experience. I suggest that if you haven't played with React Native in the past couple of years, give it a shot again, because I was in the same boat. You know, when Airbnb was using it and I was trying it, I was like, this is okay. If I want to build a simple app, I can do that. But nowadays, it's a significantly more robust, well-supported system. So I talked briefly about Expo, and I want to talk about it just a little bit more in depth because we're going to show off the app really quick and how I can use it for development. What is Expo? And so we're a company that maintains Expo CLI, Expo Go, and the Expo application service. And the goal with Expo is I want people who are good at JavaScript to write JavaScript to be able to deploy native applications. So there are challenges with deploying to Play stores, to compiling this code so that then it can be deployed as Swift or Kotlin code. And Expo CLI tries to put all that behind the magic curtain so that you don't have to deal with that. And it does a really good job of it. It also handles setting up permissions. So when you have to ask a phone to be able to use the camera, to access the media library, to access health information, you have to go through permissions checks that Google and Apple will maintain. And just being able to install a plugin that says, hey, I want to use the camera, and Expo handles all of that behind the scenes so that when you deploy to the Play Store, for example, and you don't have to worry about that, is a huge time saver. Another huge benefit is that it allows you to develop and test without a Mac. So if you're developing an app for iOS, you have to have a Mac to be able to do it. Expo, you can use the Expo Go app, which is an app you can download from the store, and you can run your local code right on a machine. Now, granted, you still need to have some form of an iOS device if you would like to, but at least I think for a lot of people, a lot of us do have an iOS device that you can use readily available, if not your own personal one. Hopefully your company has one that you can use. So, and as I mentioned before briefly, the Expo Application Service is the whole robust build system. Now we're going to talk, and I'm going to use some plugins from Expo, but I want to put a caveat out there that everything we're going to talk about that we use with Expo, you don't have to pay for it if you don't want to. If you don't want to use the Expo Application Service to deploy your app, you can build a pipeline to do that all for you, and all of the plugins are available to you for free. Now you'll have to start managing permissions and stuff like that. That's up for you and your team to decide, like, is that worth it? Is it worth paying the money for Expo to handle that all themselves? I'm not an Expo salesman. It's worth it for me. It's worth it for our team when we deploy apps. Maybe it's not for you. But I know that there's a lot of concern that I've talked to with people before that, like, that's great. This sounds like this cool magic solution, but what's the catch? I mean, the catch is it costs money if you're going to use it to deploy something to the App Store. The benefit is that you don't have to use it if you don't want to. If you want to go through the steps to build it yourself, I strongly encourage it if you've got the talent and the skill to do it. So how do I create my first React Native app with Expo CLI? So I talked about it beforehand. You can go to the Play Store or the iOS store. You can download the Expo Go app to run the app on your phone so that then you can run your local code directly from your computer to the phone to get a real working example without an emulator or anything like that. Here are some NPM scripts, npx create expo app and then a project name. These slides will again be available not only on the Discord server, and I would suggest copying them from there, but if you run these, and then if you're on an iPhone, you open your camera app, you scan the QR code that I'm going to show here in a second, depending on the app you're running, or you open the Expo Go app on Android and scan the QR code, and you're up and running. You can be up and running on non-Star Trek Wi-Fi in 30 seconds, probably less. And so to be able to get that up and running and a proof of concept that not only you'll be able to write your local code and see it on your device, if anyone is connected to the internet, you can share your app with anyone that's connected to the internet. So in a remote world, that's incredible. We have clients that we work with at Insight in California, in Europe, and I can be writing code, and they can say, hey, can we try and change this, this button to look this way? Boop, 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 change that here on my computer, and it's immediately available for the user halfway across the world to be able to see. And to be able to do that is an incredible power, in my opinion. So I sat here and I've talked about, oh my gosh, React Native is the greatest. Use Expo CLI. Oh, cool, cool, cool. But I wanted to kind of focus this presentation a little bit more on the technical side of it. So assuming that the screen follows along with me, we're going to jump over into VS Code. I'm going to start this up on my phone in about 30 seconds here, and we're going to look at some code and how we can develop our first application. You can see here that we're going to build a store for Star Trek to be able to sell clothing. So do I need to drag? Am I on a second screen? Oh, I am. Okay. Sorry, I did not know that it was going to be a second screen. Losing the mic. All right. So I'm going to go back over. Is there any way to get it so that I'm just on the one screen instead of? Yeah, I guess I could probably go into the settings in Windows, right? Yeah, that's screen. Let's do that. That'll be way easier. There we go. Good call. Let's get this up and running. All right, sorry about that. All right, so here I am. I'm going to blow this up so that everybody can see it. I hope that everybody is able to see that. So I'm going to run this npm command here. It's called npx expo start, and then I added the tunnel command afterwards. That allows it so that if anybody has the app and they would like to follow along while we're making changes, you can. You don't have to run tunnel. If you don't run tunnel, then the computer or the phone that's trying to download and run the application has to be connected to the same Wi-Fi. So I'm going to run that, assuming it starts here. All right, and then I'm going to open it up on my phone. And you can see here on the right, I've got my phone open. You could see in my command that it was downloading a bundle to my phone. Took a little bit of time to build that. It's bundling it here on my phone. And in a moment here, we should see the application. For those that would like to follow along, if you'd like to scan this QR code, again, I'm going to leave this up for just probably about 20, 30 seconds while we talk here for a little bit. Then I'm going to close it so we can actually see the code that we're going to be working with. So that's it. When you run that npx expo start, that'll be what starts up your local server so that you can host the code. This will be the screen that you'll see when you create a new React application. And so I can change this code to say whatever I want. Hi, Stir Trek. Going to save that. How's the font size? Can people see that? Is it bad? Is everybody good? Perfect. So let me know if that changes, if it needs to be. I'm going to make this a little smaller. So you can see, hey, I changed the name. Immediately updates on my phone. You can see here I'm updating it on my phone. That's for those that maybe can't see from here. I've got it running right here locally on my phone. So I'm going to I built an application that we could use, and we're going to go step by step through, and we're going to talk about all of the major components that React Native has so that you can actually build an application. So I've got this large file here with a bunch of pre-built components, which again is in the repository that you can download at any point in time after the presentation. We'll go through most of these components step by step. A couple of call outs really quick. We're hitting an external API to get some fake store products that we're going to use to populate the store that we're going to be building. We're going to use React Native's use effect to do that. We use effect right on start. We're going to get these products, fetch the API data accordingly, pass them around as props. A lot of this stuff should be pretty familiar to people who have used React beforehand. So the very first component I want to talk about, and the very first thing you might be noticing is that, hey, the status bar at the top looks like crap. Like, I can't see the icons. It's dark on a dark background. So we have React Native has a status bar component that you can build in, or that you can bring right on in. You build that or use that component. You pass a different type of style to it, and you can see here that now suddenly I've got a light version of the status bar. If I was on a dark one, you can control all of this with some form of a prop if you wanted to, that you could pass accordingly if you wanted a dark and light view. We're only going to support dark view for this demo, but know that you can do that in the future. So before we dive into the real we're going to dive into the first set of real kind of like meat and potatoes of a React Native component. So so I have here a header component that I brought in. And so I'm going to go to my header component here. And let's talk about some of these. We're going to talk about what we call view, image, style sheet, and text. So a view, for those of you who are more familiar with web development for a traditional like desktop or mobile or a mobile website, view, think of it like a div. And so most of your stuff is going to be wrapped inside of a view. That's a box that you want to, as the name implies, it's a small view that you're going to use to display content. And so for here, we have a view that's this Stir Trek shop with the logo that we have here. So the next thing we have is text. And again, as the name implies, that's how we're going to render text to the user screen when we're building a mobile application. Text will accept any kind of string that you want to pass to it here, and it'll render it. Think of it more like a span. Do know that it does only accept strings, so you can't pass it. You can't pass it, JavaScript functions that it needs to run or something like that. You might want to control that with some form of a variable that you could bring in. The next thing we're going to talk about really quickly is an image. And so, shocker, an image most closely correlates to the image tag for when you're building images on a traditional desktop website. Now, there are a couple of things that you need to know about images. First is that when you're building a mobile application, one of the things you have to kind of consider is connection might be spotty. You don't know if the user is going to be constantly connected to the internet like you would necessarily for when you're building for a traditional website. So you can bundle your images like we're doing here. So you can see I'm just using a traditional require, and I'm bringing this icon in, and that's what renders this icon over here in the top right. And you can do that, and React Native is smart enough to say, hey, that image is X by Y size. I'm going to render it there, and nothing else has to be passed through it, and I know how to do that. Now, if you're bringing in a remote image, say like we're going to do for the product images when we get there, and I'll call them back out, you have to manually set some form of a width and height. And so how do I do that? And that's where we're going to cover the last of the major, I think, 4 biggest components you're going to use with React Native, and that's a style sheet. And so at the bottom of each of these files, you're going to see this style sheet.create. And so React Native uses relatively traditional CSS properties to define all of the styles that you're going to pass to your components. There's a lot of different ways you can do this. You could make style components for people who have used those. For simplicity's sake, for the demo, I've just put all these kind of at the bottom. You can see here again, style sheet is a React Native component with a create function, and I'm going to pass it an object. And then from there, it's a traditional JavaScript object key value pattern. So I have here, header, and the names are slightly different. You can see it, there's not like dashes between. It's a camel case here for flex direction or justify content or things like that. But everything in React Native is positioned using Flexbox. So I guess if we're going backwards a little bit to talk about negatives or reasons why you might not like React Native, if you really hate Flexbox or you don't understand it, you're going to probably need to brush up on it if you're going to start using React Native, because it's heavily used to position everything that you want for your application. So again, we have here header text, and you can see the examples here. I'm passing in a style prop from my style sheet that I created. That gets passed accordingly. If I wanted to, I could, so margin vertical, instead of doing like a margin X or something like that, I could change the margin value here, and you can see, ooh, heyo. You can see that the spacing on the margin changes accordingly. So the next thing I think people might be wanting to know about is text inputs. And so we're going to skip to here the search component. So I'm going to comment that out. And you can see here now we have a search component. And we've already talked about views, images, style sheets, and things like that. Text input, again, big shocker, text input compares most closely to the input tag. And so it uses the React style of a state variable that you can pass. With onChange, I want to change the data to this. So we handle all of that here with the onChange search function. That was a state property that we set up in the initial application file. So again, if you've got good React experience, it should translate relatively easily when you're using React Native. There's not too much here to talk about. Most of this, as you can see, should be relatively familiar if you've made an input at any point in your development experience. We have placeholder. You might have to pass a placeholder text color, so you can change that to whatever you want to. So here we'll change it to black. Clearly not legible right now, but it should get the point across of how quickly you can change these things and the kind of properties you'll be able to pass to these components. So the next thing I want to try and get is, when I'm building this store, I think that what would be really useful is for people to see all the categories and to be able to filter their products accordingly. So I'm going to uncomment this categories as buttons, because when you're on a mobile device, you're probably going to want to push something. So we're going to do that real quick. Well, that doesn't look good. So let's go and talk about buttons really quick. So what we wanted, here it is, sorry, I opened the wrong one. So React Native has a button component, and the way the button component works is it's a wrapper around the iOS or Android buttons. And so what that means is that whatever iOS or Android decides their buttons should look like, that's it. You can't change. You can change the color, for example, of a button in Android. The text color you can change the text color when you're on iOS, and color will change the background color on Android. But if you want like really fine-tuned, pixel-perfect design that you're probably used to, button's not the go-ahead way to do it. I find myself, when I'm building applications, I'm not using button all that frequently. It's very rare that I have such a generic press or something that I want a user to press that I'm cool with whatever Android and iOS decides it should look like. So that, but you never know. Sometimes they do come up, and I did want to cover it because it's a major question, like how do I use buttons? So here's a button component. You pass in a title with an item. If you see here, I press the button, the jewelry button in this case, to make it the active category. It changes the color. That's controlled here with this color prop that we pass in accordingly. But why don't we look at like what a button would look like if it basically didn't look bad. So let's close that out. Close a couple of these out since I don't have as much space. So I'm going to comment that button categories as buttons component out, and I'm going to put the category component in its place. And so much better. You can see here that now I've got a horizontally scrolling set of buttons that I can scroll through for all of the categories that are currently selectable for the list of products that we have. Sorry, one sec. I wanted to get this ready. Sorry. So you can see here that I've got a horizontally scrolling list of buttons. They look much better. So how do I do that? So React Native has a component called Pressable. And Pressable is how you make custom buttons. That's its primary purpose. Anything you want a user to be able to press on that you want more fine control over, whatever the defaults Android and iOS set, use Pressable. Pressable, you could also consider it, again, kind of like a div wrapper or something like that with an on-click handler, or in this case, an on-press handler. You can put whatever you want inside of Pressable. It can be an image. It can be some text. It can be a text input if you want it to. Anything that you want to be pressable and you want something to happen to it, wrap it in a Pressable and you can pass styles. Now the negative with that, I'm going to blow this up just so we have a little bit of extra space to see. The negative with that is that now you have to maintain everything about this Pressable component by yourself. So for example, styles. when you bring a button in, it comes with all these styles for free, but when you use Pressable, you have to build all this stuff from the ground up. So you can see in here that I have this style prop that I'm passing in, and I've got a list of styles that I want to pass in as an array, and it always takes the last item in the array as the most prominent or overrides those for CSS purposes. And you can see that like it can get a little messy. I'm also not going to lie, this isn't the cleanest code I've ever written, but it should get kind of some of the points across of the negative again with Pressable is that you're going to need to build something that can be reusable again and again so that you're not passing these large style objects to each of your components accordingly, because now I'm in charge of the state, or I'm in charge of all the styles from what the press event looks like, what it looks like when it's being pressed down on, things like that. So again, you can see here, I can change the buttons and they change accordingly. So I think the next thing let's get are some products. So I'm going to uncomment the products. I'm going to refresh the app really quick to make sure that it gets the it hits the API, and if it doesn't, then we'll go with the one that doesn't need the API. So while it's loading those up, we can take a look at the products. So again, we've talked about view, text, image, pressable, style sheet. The next item we want to talk about is a flat list. And a flat list is a component that React uses so that we can pass another rendering component to it to render a list of similar items. And so in this case, you can see we have a list of products that I can sort through. And now I can start clicking on the items inside of the category buttons. It'll filter the store accordingly. So, oops, how does that all work? Let's go look at a flat list really quick. So here we have a flat list. And inside of it, I'm passing an item that I want to render, and then a function for what I want the product to look like, just for a little bit, make it a little bit cleaner. And so one, I had mentioned before that these images are from an external source. So now I have to define the image's size that I want it to render to. So you can see here that that's defined here in the style sheet. And so that's, if you don't define one, it's going to just assume 0, 0. That's the way that React Native handles images. And so that's just kind of something you're going to have to deal with if you're going to pull external sources out. But we had a list of products that came from an API that we took those in, we passed those products that we want to display to this flat list, and then they go to a component that renders them. And so, you know, there's an image inside of each item, there's some product information, a title, a price, and it all gets rendered here. Another really cool thing about flat list is it handles lazy loading for you by default. We'll see if it works here. You might have seen it for a very brief moment, but as images will come in and out of view, it will automatically handle rendering anything inside of the flat list lazy style. Now you can imagine if you had, you know, this is a super simple store. There's what, like 20 products or something like that. Walmart, for example, uses React Native, and you can imagine how many products they have. You can't render 100 products to the page for the user to download and download all of those images on a mobile connection in their application. They're going to hate you, and it's going to, you know, tank their battery life. Flat list will handle all of that lazy loading for you. It automatically will calculate, hey, we see that Brian's phone that he's using is X by Y. That's the dimensions of it. So we're going to say, hey, about, you know, 2 screen lengths is what we're going to load up, and then anything after that is going to be waiting, and as it scrolls, it'll lazy load in. Once they're lazy loaded in, you can see that it's not going to try and re-render them accordingly. But, excuse me, that's a massive benefit that you don't have to worry about any of the lazy loading functionality. Caveat to that is make sure that you understand that anything that's not loaded isn't loaded. So if there's something you need to happen, like as the thing renders, it's going to render those things over and over for you each time you scroll, because those components are getting mounted into the DOM, though it's not really a DOM because it's an app, but the point gets across. Another cool thing that you can do with the products is that you can put them in a like you can pass a property and you can re-render the components with just this number of columns. And now I have a very similar, or I'm using the same set of data and I've rendered them side by side instead. So the documentation for React Native is really great, and you can look up all these props that you can pass to each of these components to render everything that you want to your application. So that's kind of the basis of our store here. As you can see, we've got a working set of, so if I look in here, let's say, I'm sure there's probably something that says shirt, right? It'll sort those accordingly. But you've built a really generic, kind of simple, frankly, web page. What makes this different than building a traditional website? Well, let's do something cool with that. I'm going to go back up here, and I'm going to take and uncomment my store. And so I'm going to have that out. And now, assuming that the Wi-Fi doesn't, which is a bold assumption, you can see here now that we have this find the closest Star Trek conference. And so in this imaginary world, there's millions of Star Trek conferences where I can buy these clothings. And I can click on it. It's going to ask me for my permissions, so I'm only going to give them to them this time. And assuming it might not work because, again, of the connection here. But if you were to download this and run it locally, you'll definitely be able to see it working locally. Oh, well, this is a bummer. But you could at least see, you saw the permission screen. We hooked into that. Now, how do we do something like that? And we're going to use it to kind of try and build some more permission-based stuff. So we're using a pressable so that we can make this whole section at the top where the store icon is clickable. And so now when I need to ask for location permission, oops, sorry about that. When I need to ask for location permission, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hook into, let's blow this up so we have a little more space. So we brought in an Expo component called location that lets you hook into using the phone's geolocation functionality. And so we use that. We're going to bring it in here, and you can see here that the very first thing, so like I've called this function that says, hey, I need to get the location when the pressable is pressed. And so we're going to request the permissions accordingly. That's where you saw the pop-up that was like, hey, can we use location permissions for your application? If we grant it, then we're going to, if we don't grant it, we're going to send some message to the user that's like, hey, you didn't give us permissions for your location. Sorry, you're going to have to fix that. Or in this case, just permission access or permissions access location was denied. Otherwise, what we're going to do is we're going to use that location plugin from Expo to get the user's current location permission. We're going to pass. We should be able to get the latitude and longitude from that. And then, for those that are super curious, there's in this case, what we have to do is there's a formula called the Haversine formula where you can take a user's latitude and longitude and use 3D sphere math to whatever, who cares? Because the point is that somebody's already done it for you, and you can pull that code in that basically says, hey, I have a latitude and longitude. Help me figure out distance-wise how close this is to a list of other locations. So if I go so you can see here that I have a list of stores in this case that I just plugged in random latitudes and longitudes for these, and then you can pass it this formula that will tell you, hey, I need to find the closest store. Again, point is maybe not necessarily how we got to finding the closest store. It's that now I have access to the user's location data, and I can do with it something that maybe isn't 100% possible on a more traditional website. So this is cool. It's kind of rudimentary. Why don't we? I'm gonna try and find something a little different that we can build here. So one of the things that you can do that is unique to phones is something called linking. And so what linking is it's a thing called deep linking, which will let you connect to another application. For example, maybe you want to hook into PayPal, and I built an application for a local church, for example, and they wanted to be able to direct users directly to their PayPal donation screen. And so traditionally, you could just send them a URL to do that, but wouldn't it be nice if it could be done directly through the PayPal application to do that themselves? So I've got this linking component that I'm going to pull in here. I'm going to reload the app just in case. And we'll kind of go over some of the interesting stuff we're doing in here. Linking can go a lot of different ways. For example, we can link to other applications on the phone. In this case, one of the things that we're going to try and do is, and I'm not going to be offended if nobody here at StirTrex gives this random app permissions to their contact list, but in this case, I've got some code that's going to say, hey, I want to, let's make sure that you guys can see this actually. So I've given this thing permissions to look through my contact list to find any contact that has the name mom. And I can click on this button. And for the weirdos that want to write my mom's phone number down, there it is. I could call my mom right now, right here from StirTrex, and I was able to open that straight from the phone's native phone call functionality. So I'm going to go back to the app. But hey, it's Cinco de Mayo. Why don't we order some food? So I can press the DoorDash button. It'll directly open to the DoorDash application. And you can do all of that with another Expo component called linking that we brought into this application. We can pass it a URL. We can pass it, for example, for when we're opening the telephone number. Deep linking is a little bit farther outside of the scope of this whole conversation because that's on an app-by-app basis. What URL you have to pass to deep link into, for example, a very specific store on DoorDash is going to be different than if I wanted to do it on Uber Eats. But something that's really cool about deep linking is now you can see here I press the back button, boom, right back in Brian's app. Instead of linking them to a URL page where maybe you're not exactly sure where they're going to end up or if they're going to get like sucked into a new funnel, you're still keeping them kind of inside of your funnel in the navigation screen. It keeps the stack navigation so that when you change pages and things like that, you can see again. So I can go back, and I'm right back inside Brian's application. So we got a little bit more time, and I wanted to show one more cool thing that we can do here. So before we show the whole page, I want to spend a little bit more time looking here at this camera. So we've now given the app, or we're now going to ask permissions to use the camera's, or the phone's camera functionality so that a user could take a picture. We're not going to save it into their media library, but no, that is completely possible. Again, another Expo package, which, as I mentioned beforehand, is great that Expo will handle how to request those permissions automatically for you when you deploy this to the App Store. But you don't have to. You can build it yourself if you'd like. And the other cool thing that we're going to do is we're going to hook into Google's machine learning algorithm to be able to detect if the user is smiling. So, which, when you say it out loud, it's kind of weird because, like, I know people can have a problem where, like, they're like, why don't you just smile more? And you're like, why don't you just mind your own business? But, you know, a friend of mine was telling me a story about how much he struggles when he's with his friends and they've been drinking, for example, and they're like, we can never get all of us smiling because somebody's not paying attention. Well, what if we had an app that handled this? So here's this $1 million idea app. If somebody wants to build it, take my code and deploy it to the App Store and make $1 million, just write me a thank you note. So on startup, what we're going to do here, using a use effect from React, we're going to request camera permissions. I'm going to assume you're going to automatically grant camera permissions for this. I have no error handling for if you don't. In a real app, you would totally build error handling into it. But for this, let's say that you do grant camera permission access. We have some functions that are going to handle whether or not you take pictures. And we also have this function here called handle if there's faces detected. And then we detect also if the faces are smiling inside of it. And we use that with the use state to do all that. So here's the camera component that, again, we brought in from Expo. We have these face detector settings, which will hook right into Google's machine learning algorithm. And we have, using, again, that ML kit, we say, hey, here are the faces. When they're detected, I want to do this function. So these are all a bunch of properties that you can pass if you'd like to deep dive in, figure out, whether or not they're going to detect these fast, slow, however you want to do all these. But let's take a look at this in action now. So you can see here on my phone here on the right, it's now asking me for camera permissions. So sure, I'll give them to you this time. You can see here, hey, everybody here in the theater with me using but I can't press this button because nobody here is smiling. It's unfortunate, I guess. So now I'm going to flip the camera, and you can see again, I'm still not smiling because I'm all nervous or whatnot. But now if I smile, now I can take my picture. Oh, perfect. How could that not gone better? How couldn't that have gone better? There we go. At least I have my eyes open, right? So again, we were able to do all that, and we were able to spin this application up within a very short time frame. Granted, I probably have a little bit more experience than somebody who's really new to the ecosystem, but I'm able to say, hey, how do I get camera? I want to use React Native. How do I get camera permissions? Here's the plugin that I need to use it. I'm going to npm install that. I'm going to read the small documentation section that says, hey, here's what you need to pass to the camera to make it work. Here's how you can determine whether or not you're using like the selfie cam or the back cam. And then I can build my application from there. And I'm able to run all that from my local computer onto a actual device, no emulators, no, you don't have to go hoping that, I mean, how many times have you built something, you're like, it works on my machine, works in the emulator, that's great. Like now you have an actual device that you can run it in, and you can run it so that anybody can see it anywhere in the world, assuming they have an internet connection. So we covered a lot in this topic, and I know that there's probably going to be, it's kind of a lot to take in. So I really appreciate everybody sticking with me here. I hope everybody really learned a lot. I've got plenty of time here for questions. I know there were some people that were talking about how do I build and actually deploy something to the App Store. Feel free to come on down. You can talk to me about that. I'd love to talk to anybody who wants to know a little bit more about React Native. I've been using it for a while here. We started picking it up at our company about 6-7 months ago, and we've been building some internal tools, and then I've been using it for some personal side projects to build. I'm all in on it. There's all sorts of great stuff you can do with apps, and as I've been in the field for 10 years, really good at JavaScript, I guess, and so I'm fully in on it. And I think that for anybody that has tried it before and been like, this sucks, your feelings are totally valid. It did suck. It was not good a couple of years ago, but within the last 8 to 12 months, they've really turned it around. They've got a lot of tools in place to make the developer experience significantly easier. And I guess that's really it. I really appreciate everybody's time. Were there any questions? Anybody have any? Do we have any from Discord first? Or okay, no. Did anybody have any questions? It's like blinding to see into this light. You got a question here? There is a freemium version. I think it's like, oh, yes, you're right. Thank you. The question was, I had mentioned that Expo has a cost as their freemium version. There is a freemium version. You can get 30 deploys or 30 builds of your application per month for free. 15 of those can be on iOS, as many as you want. Up to 30 can be on Android. There's always the cost of that it costs $99 to build, to have an Apple developer account. You can't. That's outside of Expo. But if you do want to again like start finagling with this yourself, or even build just an app for you to use locally and sideload it on an Android, for example, you can totally do that, and you can do it all for free. The question was, you could build this code base and deploy it to the web if you wanted to. And yes, the answer to that is yes, if that's the pattern you want to. My personal professional experience is that if you're going to build some form of an application that can be used both as as an actual app that's deployed to an app store or something like that, and to the website, I would create a series of utility files that can be reused across both applications. And then you might get data back from an API, and you pump your data into that API and transform it. Reason for that is that React Native was built from the ground up to be used predominantly on apps. It does use React DOM under the hood to render traditional websites if that's what you want to do. I've just had some problems with it. Frankly, it's probably a little bit of inexperience with trying to make a one-size-fit-all an app and a website and things like that. I know some people have had good luck with it, but I would suggest, if you're going to build an app to be an app to its strengths instead of kind of like maybe trying to find a middle ground that'll work for both things. Plus, there are some other issues with, for example, if you were building a health app and you can't make that accessible on the web because there's not health information that you can get. If you're trying to do biometric scanning so that your user can unlock the phone or something, like that's not available on the web. Of course, you can hide all that stuff if necessary. But again, at that point, I just feel like I would rather really focus on building the best app instead of building something that kind of works in both locations. Any other questions?
Did you have any other examples of ways in which trying to build one app for both platforms like wouldn't feel native in those platforms?
So the question was, do you have any other examples of how building an application for both platforms might not feel native? Now, are you talking about like iOS and Android, or iOS and like a traditional? Okay, and so he said yes, that it would be like iOS versus Android. Button is the big one, where again it's just a wrapper around the traditional button that Android and Apple have decided this is how a button looks for us. There are no other, everything else, it's a blank slate. If I go, I'm gonna boot this application. Oh, did it crash? Probably crashed because we haven't used it in a while. We'll see if it starts back up in time, but a lot of this stuff is built in a way that you have to pass these styles, and if you're not passing a style to it, it's again just like rendering a blank div, like with no styles attached to it. So it's a transparent box that you can put some content into it accordingly, which again means that you're going to have to spend that effort to put the styling in place, but the benefit is that it's going to be consistent across both because you built it that way instead of relying on whatever Android or iOS serves you. Any other questions? Sorry. I'm telling you, it's blinding. It's like, sorry, what was up? Yes, you can, and I think there might be an example in this. There is not, I'm sorry. Oh, the question was, similar to the media queries we were talking about beforehand, is there something that you can serve slightly different designs or styles or something similar for Android or iOS? And again, going back to that constants file, you do have a platform. You have platform data that you can hook into, and you can say, hey, is it iOS or is it Android? And that'll just be up to you and your design team. Like again, sometimes Android users might be expecting something different. A very good example would be the back button. iOS doesn't have the traditional back button that you're kind of seeing on my phone here as an Android, and so you may be building something slightly different on Apple to maybe replicate that functionality for your app. Maybe that's the design you kind of want. But yeah, there's a platform constant as well as like orientation and a bunch of other options in the constants that'll give you a lot of device information. Any other questions? All right, well, I really appreciate your time, everybody. Thanks a bunch for sticking around late in the day. Really means a lot. I had a great time presenting to you. Feel free to come up. I'm going to be here and also seeing the movie. My information is also available in the deck. You can get it here, my work email and my personal email. Again, if you go to the Discord, you can see the GitHub, so you can see examples of how this whole thing was built, and you can run it yourself. And you can see some of the documentation for how to use React Native in Expo. Thanks again.